name is Emily, and I'm super excited to be here. If you guys remember, 2 weeks ago, Joseph Dodd spoke. He spoke on Abraham, but before he started teaching, he told you guys this little story. I don't know if you guys remember, but he told you guys that he really wanted to teach on a certain person. He really wanted to teach on Joseph, but because the series had kind of been mapped out at a meeting he wasn't at, he didn't get to pick Joseph because someone else picked him. That'd be me. So what Joseph left out of his story, though, is how he went about trying to steal this from me. And I feel like you guys need to know because it's kind of really funny. So the end of August, I'm up in the Camp Verde area kayaking with my mom and Kelly and my nephew. And the water's super calm. So I have my phone out in a baggie because, want to be safe on the river. And I start getting these text messages from Joe saying, hey, what are you teaching on at the Porch? And I was like, oh, I'm teaching the story of Joseph. My main thing's going to be this. And it's going to be God's, origin of his plan for our life. Well, he texts me back and says, I don't get it. Well, in that same moment, I kayaked through a tree, like a little tree branch that fell down. And not little, it was big. Like I got stuck in this branch. And then I, kind of wiggle my way out of it, and I get to the other side, and I pick my phone back up to try to justify why I wanted to teach this and why it was going to be good and how it made sense. And all of a sudden, I feel something crawl across my leg. I look down, and there's a spider. Now, I don't do spiders. Spiders terrify me, like deathly afraid of them. So in this moment of there's a spider crawling across my leg, I scream. Not only do I scream, I throw my hands. Kelly actually captured this on camera, and I'm going to share this with you all. That's me. That is a look of pure terror. You see the oar in the air, but what you don't see is my phone, because this is the moment it flew. My phone, in this panic of a spider crawling across my legs, flies into the river. I scream spider, then I scream my phone! And I abandon my kayak, jump in. That's the tree I went through. But here's what I discovered later when I got back to the church and I was talking and telling Dan this story, because I also then didn't have a phone so no one could get a hold of me. Dan goes, oh yeah, Joe was trying to make you think it didn't make sense so he could teach it, or see if he could tag team and teach the same thing. And I was like, I just threw my phone in a river to justify why I wanted to teach this, and Joe was trying to steal it from me. So here's the moral of this story. Don't text your coworkers when they're on vacation, because there's a reason they're taking a vacation. But then what I also learned is, guys, don't text while kayaking. Like, I feel like there needs to be signs now, like you have on the road, because stuff like this could happen. You never know when a spider's gonna crawl across your leg or anything. And just so you all know, it was a daddy long leg, so I was not in any harm's way. But I don't do spiders. It was really scary. And I was also the only person in our group that ever had a spider on their kayak, and I had 4 in total that day. Because when I went to crawl back into my kayak, there were 3 more, and I just was about ready to swim my way down the rest of the river, because just don't do spiders. But all that to be said, I just felt the need to, tell you guys why I was so adamant on teaching this, and that Joe didn't really get to play the innocent. I was too late in the meeting to pick this card because I may still blame him for losing my phone. But anyways, let's go ahead and move on to our actual message. I'm super, super excited to close out our Genesis series and to share one of my favorite stories. There's a reason. Also, we can take that picture down now. There we go. Like, I don't need you guys to keep seeing that look of terror while I'm teaching. So for the past 4 weeks, we've been looking at the origin of some of the things that are fundamental to our faith. And they've been a bit broad, and today we're going to really take it and we're going to take a real personal look. And we're going to take a look at what is the origin of God's plans for our life. Now, disclaimer, I'm not going to stand up here and be able to go to each one of you and say, this is the plan God has for you. I don't know. I don't know his individual plan for each of us, but what I do know through this story is God does have a plan for each and every one of us. And for a lot of us, that plan can seem unknown or frustrating. And at times we're going to find ourselves feeling a lot like Joseph. So Joseph's story starts when he was just 17 years old, and he was working as a shepherd for his father and his 11 brothers. It starts with Genesis 37. Also, disclaimer, there is a lot of scripture this morning because Joseph's story travels from Genesis 37 all the way to Genesis 50. I won't read verse by verse because we would be here for a week, but there is a lot of scripture because there's a lot that happens, and I'm not a better author, and so I just go straight to who wrote it. But so Genesis 37, 1 through 4, we see the beginning. So Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan, and this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Right off the bat, we get the feeling that Joseph and his brothers might not have the best relationship. Move on to the rest of the verse. Now Israel, who is also called Jacob, he goes back and forth between the two, so don't get confused, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, I only have one brother. He's 5 years older than me. But sometimes I feel like my brother would say this was true for him, that I'm the favorite in my family. My mom won't deny it. But there are times where I feel like my brother growing up could not say a kind word. So I can't imagine having 10 older brothers who hated me so much that they couldn't say a kind word to me. But this is kind of the life Joseph lives. Now the story continues, and this is the first time we start to see that God has a unique plan for Joseph. So Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." Okay, maybe not the smartest thing for someone to say when they know your brothers hate you, because his brother said, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream. You would think Joseph would learn. But remember, how old is Joseph? 17. He lacks tact because he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now this I think is important because remember, Joseph's father loved him the most. But even when Joseph's father heard that he told his brothers this dream, he's like, "What are you thinking? Your brothers don't like you. Why would you tell them about this dream?" But his father didn't tell him to disregard the dream. And his father also tucked that back in his memory because he knew there was something about this dream. But now what was it? This dream, they're prophetic dreams. And they're foretelling of a future to come for Joseph. That at some point Joseph will reign over his brothers. At some point his brothers will bow down to him. And this dream came from God. And I believe God revealed this dream to Joseph so Joseph knew, hey, there's something greater for you. There's something greater that I have for you beyond being a shepherd. But Joseph just didn't understand that you probably shouldn't share that dream with the 10 people who hate you. Because what do you think those 10 people are going to try to do? Make sure that dream can never come true. And that's exactly what happened. So these next couple verses, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. But Joseph's dad asked him to go check on his brothers in the field. Remember, they're all shepherds, so they're keeping track of the flocks. And so his brothers saw him in a distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Again, brothers really don't like him. Now he had these dreams. They're like, there's no way you're reigning over us one day. And they even said, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Now, Joseph probably had no clue that his brothers thought this way. Because again, 17, clearly lacked some tact, might have lacked some critical thinking abilities in this moment. And so he's just, doing what his dad said. Let's continue. When Reuben heard this, he's one of the older brothers, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Let's just throw him and not lay a hand on him, because he didn't want him to actually die, and he planned on coming back and rescuing him and taking him to his dad. Okay, Reuben's like good guy. But this isn't exactly what happens, even though this is what Reuben wanted. Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, they took him and threw him into the cistern, and it was empty, but there was no water. Continuing on. Oh, we skipped some, that's okay. I'm gonna paraphrase this next. Joseph's in this cistern, okay? And then the brothers see a group of Egyptians, and they're like, hey, even better idea. Let's sell him as their slave. That'll get him way out of our house, way out of our hands, and then we can take his robe that dad, made for him, cover it with animal blood, convince dad that he's dead, and we'll never have to deal with him again, but we'll know he's alive. So that's exactly what they did. So Joseph gets sold into slavery. He's living in Egypt, far away, and I'm sure poor little young Joseph in this moment goes from, I'm just checking on my brothers, to, oh my gosh, what just happened? I'm in a land I don't know. I'm with people I don't know. I'm a slave. I'm sure he's hurt. He's angry. He's confused. And I'm sure he's wondering, where is God? Why did this happen? Why did I have these dreams not too long ago that my brothers would bow down to me, but now I'm a slave? Now I'm the lowest of lows. But I love this little passage right here. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Even though Joseph's life was crumbling before his eyes, right? How do you go from living with your family to sold somewhere else into slavery? Even though everything he knew had disappeared, God was still present, and God was with him, and so he prospered. And I think this is one of the important things we can learn is even when life isn't going as we envisioned, God is still actively working. A lot of times we have this picture of how our life should be, and when it takes a detour, it's really easy for us to start to think, God, where'd you go? God, why am I all alone in this? And we start to feel like God isn't there and isn't working anymore. But a lot of times, God's still right there. He's just moving and redeeming things, and it's just not how we pictured it would be. But this also doesn't mean that life will suddenly get easier for us just because we know God's actively working. Because for Joseph, life got good again. He got put as head of the household. Life was going great. God's still working. But then Joseph ends up in jail because his master's wife falsely accused him of trying to sleep with her, even though really she was the one trying to tempt Joseph. And when he said no, she got angry. He ends up in jail. So recapping Joseph's life again, shepherd boy who his father adores, brothers hate. Brothers sell him to slavery. Ends up in Egypt. Things look okay. He's put in charge. And now to the lowest again, you're in prison. Again, Joseph's probably thinking, God, where are you? What happened to these dreams? This is not how I envisioned my life. In Genesis 39:20 through 23, this is after Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So even when Joseph's questioning what is happening, why do all these bad things keep happening to me, God still shows up and still puts favor upon Joseph so he becomes well-liked. Now Joseph's in prison for 2 years, and the theme of dreams comes up again. Remember, Joseph had that dream years and years ago about his brothers bowing down to him. No one had to interpret those dreams for him because Joseph understood what God was saying to him. But 2 years into being in prison, the Pharaoh starts having these weird dreams. And he's trying to find anyone who can tell him what these dreams mean, to interpret them. And nobody can do it. But then one of the Pharaoh's workers says, there's a man in prison, Joseph, he can tell you this dream. So because of God's goodness in Joseph's life and God's presence, Joseph's able to interpret this dream for the Pharaoh. And it was a weird dream. It was these 7 cows that were really fat, and they ate other cows, and they had really skinny cows. Like, very weird. One of those dreams, if I had, I would wake up and be like, what did I watch before I went to bed? Like, just super weird. But Joseph hears this dream, and he says, I can't interpret this, but God can. And he was able to warn the Pharaoh that there was going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Now, the Pharaoh is thrilled that Joseph's able to interpret this because now Egypt can prepare. So for the 7 years of plenty, instead of being gluttons and eating everything, they're putting some aside. They're saving. But they're also the only place that knows what's coming. So the 7 years of plenty ends, and the 7 years of famine begins. Joseph's now elevated into a leadership position in Egypt, and suddenly everyone wants to come to Egypt to buy grain from them, to survive. They're in literal survival mode now. In Genesis 42:6 says this, now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Does that sound familiar? We see that original dream initially coming to fruition. Now, Joseph's brothers don't recognize him. He doesn't look how he used to look. He's also aged, One, being thrown into slavery and into prison will immediately age someone. But then time, we all grow up. So they don't recognize him. But Joseph recognized them immediately. And I have to imagine in this moment, he remembers that dream. And he's probably also thanking God for his goodness in this moment. And then it continues, Genesis 45:1-8. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household and ruler of all of Egypt. Guys, this is a beautiful passage right here, because if I was Joseph and my brothers were in front of me begging for food, I can't say I would respond that way. But Joseph understood that his brothers did horrible things to him, but he saw the greater, bigger picture, and that was that he needed to come to Egypt. He needed to be there to be able to help preserve this land and to help pave a way for his family to survive. And we also see the dream coming full circle, because Joseph is still in an elevated leadership position, and his brothers end up actually living under him. And so then the story goes on, they all live happily in Egypt together. The Pharaoh makes sure that they're well taken care of. And then Jacob dies. And suddenly, Joseph's brothers all get a little nervous. And they're all convinced that Joseph never forgave them. They're convinced that that last passage we read wasn't true. They thought it was all this giant facade that Joseph put on just to make their dad happy. You know, because as I know, my parents always hated when my brother and I would fight. They'd be like, go apologize. It would be like, I'm sorry. And it was never sincere. You know, it was always just like, oh, make mom and dad happy. That's what Joseph's brothers think that whole apology was just to make dad happy in his final days. But then Genesis 50, 15 through 21 tells us otherwise. And this is my favorite part of Genesis. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongdoings they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Right here, Joseph is really hurt by this because he realizes his brothers didn't really believe his apology. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him, saying, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. When I found out we were doing a Genesis series, it was that passage right there that I went to Dan and said, I want to teach on this. Because I think this shows us so much about who Joseph was. His brothers had guilt for years and years and years because they know what they did was wrong. But at every turn, Joseph had this choice. He had this choice to be bitter and get revenge or to act in God's grace and forgive. And he always chose forgiveness. Joseph knew there was a higher calling on his life, and he knew God had great plans for him. And he wasn't going to let his brothers steal his joy, even though they tried, and they tried hard. And here's where it comes personal for us. God has a plan for each and every one of us. And we are going to encounter people who don't want that to come to fruition. Now, I hope we don't get sold into slavery or get thrown into prison, but we're going to have similar things happen. We're going to be told, you're not smart enough for that. You can't do that. You're not qualified for that. Or people will come in and just try to even steal our opportunities. And we're going to have people who will try to play God in our lives and try to derail his great plan for us. But here's the truth we need to cling on to. God is still good and actively working, even when everything else feels like it's falling apart or when the entire world feels like it's working against us. Joseph lost everything, but chose to cling to that truth and chose to always choose forgiveness over bitterness. So when life gets hard and I feel like people are trying to hurt me, I cling very heavily to Genesis 50:20, the one that says, what you intended for evil, God has intended for good. Because I know people are going to do things that are not going to make me happy, are going to do things that go against God's plan for my life. But I need to choose to see the bigger picture. So people may hurt us. People may even have the intention and desire to do nothing good for us and only hurt us and try to derail us. And that's on them. And the guilt will probably stick with them just like it did with Joseph's brothers. But the responsibility then falls on us. Do we let it derail us and live in bitterness and anger? Or do we forgive and live in the joy and goodness that God has for all of us? Because if there's one thing we learned from Joseph, is that living in the goodness and the joy and forgiveness is so much better than to live in bitterness. Because I think if Joseph would have lived in that bitterness, he wouldn't have seen how God was still working. He wouldn't have seen the favor of God on his life. So we all have a unique calling. But what are we going to do when the road gets tough? What are we going to do when it feels like God has completely abandoned us and we're at our lowest of lows? I hope we can live in the joy and the goodness and choose to forgive. And what we're going to do now is the band's going to come up, and we're going to have a time of reflection and prayer and worship. And during this time, I really challenge you guys to ask yourself this question. Do I feel like God has abandoned me? Do I feel like life is not going how I envisioned it? And am I bitter about that? If you need to talk to someone or you need prayer, we'll have some leaders around the room too, but really take this time as some personal reflection as we sing this next song. And will you all pray with me? Dear God, thank you, God, that even when life feels messy and when it feels like everything's working against us, God, that you are still in control. God, and even when we're at our lowest of lows and nothing makes sense in our life, God, that you are still working. God, thank you that you have a beautiful and unique plan for each and every one of us. God, I pray that we can cling to that. God, give us the courage to forgive those who have hurt us. God, and the ability to let that go. God, help us to live in your goodness and grace. God, and just even in the joy of life. God, and to not stay in bitterness and anger. God, just thank you for all that we could learn from Joseph. And God, I pray that we apply it to our lives. In your name, amen.